Good morning, good afternoon and good evening from wherever it is in the world that you're joining us. Welcome to this, our latest event in the popular FIDIC 2022 webinar series for global and infrastructure professionals. My name is Tony Barry and I'm the president of FIDIC, the International Federation of Consulting Engineers. I'm very pleased to see so many of you joining us for this webinar on what is a very important topic for our industry. The title of today's event is Greening the FIDIC Rainbow Contract Suite, Let's Do It. And I'm grateful for all the hard work put in by the FIDIC Contracts Committee and the Secretariat who've organised the event for us today. At FIDIC, we are very focused on sustainability and a net zero agenda, and so we should be. The construction industry has a huge impact on the sustainability of our world. The industry's transformation from a big polluter and resource consumer towards a sustainability enabler is happening, but it's still too slowly to meet climate emissions targets. FIDIC has a proud record in this area, and as an organisation, we've been focusing on sustainability for more than 100 years. In fact, it's one of the core values of FIDIC. We also recently launched our FIDIC Climate Change Charter to encourage engineers to take the lead to plan, design and develop projects in line with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Our contracts will play a key role in this. At this webinar, members of the FIDIC Contracts Committee and other experts in their field will discuss how we can integrate net zero clauses and embed sustainable performance criteria for the project lifestyle into the FIDIC Rainbow contract suites for works and services. It's crucial that we do this. The result will not only be improved profitability and productivity and better delivered projects, but will also improve the planet in the process. Around the world on construction infrastructure projects and programs, large and small, we're seeing an important shift from calling for action for climate change on net zero and sustainability issues into day-to-day practical implementation that will make a real difference on the ground. There'll be a lot to learn along the way as we work together, and acknowledge sharing amongst all the members of the project team will be extremely valuable. At today's event, we will no doubt hear about how using the FIDIC golden principles on contracts will lead to greater clarity and fairness between the contract parties and better project outcomes. We'll also hear how the FIDIC Climate Change Charter is helping the industry to plan and design for a low carbon future. Incidentally, if your organisation has not yet signed up to the Charter, I'd strongly urge you to do so and join the many leading global construction companies and consulting companies that have pledged to do all they can to make a difference on the crucial issue of sustainability and net zero. If I could have the next slide, please. Just a small advertorial. FIDIC has been running very consistent programs for the last number of years and webinars in particular. And our next webinar is on the 24th of May. Cutely titled Around the World in 90 Minutes, Changes and Future Trends in the Delivery of Consulting Engineering. On the 23rd of June, we'll go back to our State of the World series and we'll pick up on transport and how do we address the marine and aviation emissions issues. And of course, between the 11th and the 20th of May, in this week and the coming weeks, we have the FIDIC International Contract Users Conference for the regions, starting with Africa and then moving across to Asia Pacific. So with that, I'd like to now hand over to Kiri Parr, a member of the Contracts Committee, and ask her to introduce her speakers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tony, and it's a delight to be with everyone tonight or this morning or this afternoon. I'm really pleased. We've got 4 fantastic speakers today, really knowledgeable in the area. And what's very important, I think, is that they're coming to this issue from diverse parts of the industry. Adriana Spassova, who's on our Contracts Committee, is a very experienced consultant and has been very, very active at an industry level in her home country of Bulgaria. we're represented by the owner perspective with Emeline Oudin from the French Development Agency, with Eugenio Zoppis from Webuild in Italy, and representing the contractor perspective, and Millie Farmelo, who's in the Arup legal team, dealing with the designers' issues. And I think as we tackle this topic from these four perspectives, we'll get a lot out of it. The structure of the next hour and a half, and we have a lovely rich hour and a half today, is each of the speakers are going to be speaking for approximately 10 to 15 minutes. This is a technical subject, and we're giving the speakers time to really dive into how contracts can be used to achieve the goals that Tony introduced us with. And we've got over 600 people joining us or have registered to join us. I see all those greetings coming through on that chat line. And hello to my fellow Australians, and hello to our registrants coming in from the Ukraine as well. It's wonderful that you are all here. There's a Q&A session, so we've got some time, so please put some questions through as they come through. I will do my very, very best to make sure we get to as many of those questions at the end of our hour and a half. Hopefully we'll have 20 to 30 minutes of time to really explore some of the conversations and the discussions and the views of our four wonderful speakers, who I will introduce in detail just prior to their main speech. Before we launch into our first speaker, I've got a quick poll. If everyone could let me know whether you are using or negotiating net zero contracts in your contracts already. Have you seen these already? Yes or no? Let's give everyone 20 or 30 seconds to answer this question and see where we go. All right, from the organizers, how maybe we can start seeing what the results are summing to get. So no, that is actually relatively surprising. So basically, what have we got? 86% of you are not starting to use or see these contracts in your environment, in your own contracts. That is fascinating in and of itself, isn't it? We have, and I think this means that this topic is so timely, and I think Adriana will stay in the space. I'm so glad she really is a huge champion of this area as from the Contracts Committee, that we've all become aware of the need for climate change, but actually translating it into day-to-day reality in our day-to-day contracts is still a journey we are all to go on. So on that note, we might kick off our first speaker, and I'll introduce Adriana Spassova. Adriana is a partner at EQE Control Bulgaria, a really well-educated, unbelievably well-educated lawyer in the construction field, with both original qualifications as an engineer, as well as a Master's of Construction Law, and currently, and also a PhD focusing on compliance with international standards. And I know Adriana is going to really tackle that issue in her speech, and a FIDIC accredited adjudicator and trainer. And as I mentioned earlier, Adriana is on the FIDIC Contracts Committee, joining last year. So without further ado, Adriana, I might hand the floor over to you.
Thanks, Kiri, for this introduction. Upgrading me to a lawyer is too much, but actually I'm a civil engineer with construction law qualification, and I'm very passionate about this topic. So I believe that in the end of this, many of you will try to integrate green provisions in your contract, or even without integrating them in the projects you are doing, you can do something. Next one, please. So as you have heard in the introduction, sustainability is one of FIDIC founding principles, and FIDIC has published a lot of tools, a lot of reports which are focused on sustainability. And one of the recent ones about net zero says that we will not meet the sustainability goals and net zero if we do not engage on every level. Next one, please. So now we have this new branding, which is FIDIC for Global Goals, which is uniting all these efforts. And we have the FIDIC Climate Change Charter, which is a high-level commitment. And now we have to see how really in the field, in the projects, we can do these commitments for project green procurement, innovations, going to these net zero targets and reporting on the progress. Next one, please. We have to act now because it's already late. So let's start from the procurement. It's very important to focus on green procurement and not on the low prices for the selection of contractors and consultants. So we can insert some evaluation criteria like carbon footprint criteria. We can have some requirements for ISO 14,000 certificates. We can have a requirement for environmental management action plan, waste management plan, for green suppliers, reusable materials, and so on. And we can rank the proposals for net zero actions. Next one, please. So let's go now to the suite for services. Here we can integrate net zero provisions in the scope of services, and the consultants are in a very important position because working as designers, as technical advisors in all stages of the project development, as FIDIC engineers during the construction, we can do a lot. We can do a lot to change the conditions going towards the net zero targets. And focusing on this, we can move to the works contract now. In the works contract, we can do a lot greening the technical documents first. This is the specification under the red book, and the other books have the employer's requirements. So here we can do two things. We can have net zero targets for the construction, like carbon footprint reduction targets, and we can introduce also net zero performance guarantees, which can be underpinned by net zero performance damages and net zero performance bonuses. Next one. Here in the technical documents, we can integrate specific requirements for environmental action plan, waste management plan, carbon footprint measurements and reporting, green supplies, and so on. And our focus has to be to have explicit wording with specific carbon reduction objectives and metrics. Next one. So it is very important to report, for example, on a quarterly basis, how we are reaching the net zero targets. And you have available different standards. You can easily integrate them in the specification or employer's requirements, like the greenhouse gas standards, which are freely available in internet. Next one. FIDIC has been focused on sustainability for more than 100 years. So unlike other standard forms, FIDIC has explicit wording in the general condition of the works contract, which is focused on sustainability. Of course, the main general clause is subclause 4.18 for protection of the environment, but it is underpinned by other provisions like this requirement for compliance with those obligations by the employer's personnel and other contractors under 2.3. Then we have the employer's continuous obligation to make available data on climate, environmental conditions under 2.5. We have the provisions for the obligations of the contractor related to sustainability, like minimum use occupation of roads and footpaths, like restricting the pollution, and also doing its operation in a sustainable manner. And we have the provisions which are explicitly mentioning environmental laws and regulations, and they are referring us to the employer's requirements, and we can include specific wording there for integration of additional standards. And we have a very strong tool in the hands of the engineer under 6.9, because the engineer may require the contractor to remove any person persisting in environmental misconduct. Okay, let's go now to the next one and see what specifically we can do. I shall give you some suggestions. These suggestions are for each works contract, but I'm giving just for examples the clauses from the Yellow Book 2017. So first of all, we can introduce different definitions and then go to the specific provisions, like having a fully digital project with no paperwork, then having persons allocated to sustainability, like the sustainability monitoring assistant from the side of the engineer or environmental management officer in the key personnel of the contractor. Then we can have specifically allocated sustainability meetings, and under clause 4 we can introduce wording for different sustainability requirements, like the main obligation, the contractor to comply with the net zero targets under 4.1, and then the requirements for suppliers for the planning of different sustainability measures under 4.10, and to plan the shortest routes under 4.15, then to have smart logistics, which is focused on net zero. Next one, please. And we can also green other provisions under clause 4, which are related to contractors' equipment and temporary utilities. We can prohibit the use of diesel generators, for example, and we can have a requirement for charging points for electrical vehicles. Of course, it is very important to add some provisions which are specific for the green reporting under 4.20. And then we can have, for example, specific wording for introduction of some sustainable construction measures, like just-in-time working and reduction of emissions. And then it is very important to have under 6.10 the requirement to maintain detailed greenhouse gas records, because those results could be later on integrated and they can be used to fully offset the lifetime emissions of the assets. So we have the previous one, please, because I want to point out here it is very important to use properly 13.2, the value engineering provision. We can first of all add here E to have positive environmental impact for each of the proposals of the contractor under this provision. And then we can add here the net zero value engineering provision and the incentives for green modifications. And here under 13.4, we can have the green budget, which is a very important instrument, because here we can have additional payment for net zero incentives, for also bonuses for exceeding the net zero targets. And of course, we can have performance damages under the relevant subclauses for failure to meet the net zero targets. And we can have the virtual adjudication arbitration, and the employer can add a ground for termination for contractor's default for non-compliance with the net zero requirements. Next one, please. And of course, we can green the subcontracts. Presently, we can do this in the subcontract for the 99 red and yellow books. But last week, we have restarted task group 9, which is going to develop at least 6 new forms. And in the term of reference, we have this option to develop wording for green incentives and compliance with sustainability targets and requirements for green suppliers. Next one, please. So you can have some ready wording, which is developed by legal professionals under the Chancery Lane projects. This climate contract green book is available, and you can use, for example, the Luna clause, the Ashcan clause, Easy clause, Tristan clause, and all these others which are listed because they are very relevant, and you can plug in to those listed subclauses the relevant wording. So it is not difficult, just try it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Adriana. And my main takeaway from that is that there's so much already in the contracts that are probably underused and that we can take a much greater advantage of. All right, so our next speaker is Emeline Oudin. Emeline is the head of procurement support from the French Development Agency, started her career in with a master's degree in agronomy and put that skill set for direct use for the French Development Agency out in the field in countries like Madagascar and the Comoros Islands. They sound very adventurous to me, Emeline. She's now back in Paris and manages the appraisal and implementation, came back to Paris to do more work on procurement, and procurement has become her passion piece. So Emeline, maybe if you can give your insight about what it takes to achieve net zero outcomes from the owner's perspective.
Thank you, Kiri. Hello to all. So I'm going to begin my presentation with AFD's commitments toward climate change and the environment, and how this can be taken into account in the infrastructure project preparations. I'm going then to focus on the reinforcements of the environmental, social, health and safety issues we made in our standard bidding documents for works. So to start with, so as Kiri said, we are from the French Development Agency. We are a bilateral financial institution, and we finance projects in many sectors, such as energy, water and sanitation, transportation, health, for instance, in 115 countries and in the French overseas. And in 2021, AFD earmarked 12 billion euro to projects that support the Sustainable Development Goals. And since 2017, one of our annual objectives is that 50% of our financing goes to projects that have a direct and beneficial impact to climate. Next slide. We met this objective in 2021 with, as you can see, a 6 billion euro commitment to climate. And on the diagram on the right side of the slide, you can see that 50% goes to climate change mitigation projects. It means projects that help reduce greenhouse gas emission, for instance, energy performance improvement in buildings. And almost a third of the projects financed by AFD are projects that contribute to adaptation to climate change. It means, for instance, the improvement of resilience of population, ecosystem, and infrastructure to climate change. Each AFD financing is analyzed during the preparation phase to check that the project to be financed is consistent with long-term low carbon and resilient development in the country, which will be implemented. This kind of analyses are included in the feasibility and preliminary technical studies of the infrastructure to be financed. It means that the design studies need to take into consideration, for instance, the potential impact of climate change on the infrastructure, or how to minimize the greenhouse gas emission during the construction phase and during the operation of the infrastructure. So we try to have some also innovations through these preliminary studies and technical studies. Moreover, for each large infrastructure project, we require the project's owner, so the project that is benefiting from our financing, to carry out an environmental and social impact study, the ESIA, of the infrastructure, in order to determine the impacts it may have and the possible mitigation measures to be taken. These mitigation measures are included in an environmental and social management plan, which specify at which stage each measures shall be implemented. So is it at the design phase or during the construction phase or during the operation phase, and by which stakeholder they must be taken into consideration? Should it be the employer, the contractor, the entity in charge of the operation of the infrastructure? The outcome of those studies, the ESIA and the ESMP, may lead to a modification of the design of the infrastructure to limit its impact. For instance, a different road layout can be proposed to avoid to go through a protected area, as an example. You can stay on the previous slide, thank you. I just wanted also to highlight the part circled in red on the right. For infrastructure with major activity of civil engineering, the ESMP always include measures related to the construction phase and to the worksite management. It includes, for instance, environmental measures such as measures to avoid pollution or to protect biodiversity during the construction phase, or also social measures, local recruitment, or health first aid in case of an accident, safety, to be show that personal protective equipment are provided by the contractor to its staff, and so on. You can go to the next slide. You can go on. Yes. So I just wanted to show you some illustrations of what we don't want to see, or what we don't want to see anymore on the projects we finance. For example, staff working on the roof without any adequate protective equipment, or oil pouring on the soil with the threat of pollution, or waste thrown away around the work site and not in a controlled landfill. So you can go on. So we decided in 2017 as a donor to have strengthened ESHS requirements for worksite management in the works contract we finance. So the goal was to be able to select a qualified and experienced contractor that will be capable of applying the right measures to protect the environment, people during the implementation of the contract, and also to have within the contract an effective ESHS management to be sure that the requirements, that the contractor complies with all the requirements regarding ESHS issues and challenges. You can go on. So more precisely, yes, we added ESHS requirements in our standard bidding documents for works. It can be for works and also design build or design build operate contracts. First, in the qualification criteria, so on top of the classical financial and past experience criteria, bidder must also meet ESHS criteria, such as having an ISO certification or providing proof of having already managed properly a worksite where ESHS impacts were similar to the ones of the works to be carried out. And we also added some evaluation criteria. And for example, the bidders must provide a methodology describing how they will deal concretely with some crucial ESHS challenges of the worksite. So it's a way to be sure that the contractor has understand the importance of ESHS issues and will be capable of dealing with these issues during the implementation of the contracts. And in the contract, sorry, we also developed 40 pages of ESHS specifications that are part of the bidding documents and that will become part of the contract. And these are the standards ESHS measures to mitigate the common risks and impacts during a construction phase. And of course, they can be adjusted to the scope and to the extent of the works to be carried out. So they are kind of additions to the technical specifications. And for international procurement competition, we highly recommend the beneficiaries or the project owners of our financing to use FIDIC conditions of contracts. And our standard bidding documents are based on FIDIC Pink Book or Yellow Book or Gold Book. And we developed adjusted particular conditions. So on my last part of the presentation, I would like to present you some additions we made to FIDIC conditions of contract. So we made them through the ESHS specifications and also the particular conditions of contracts. And we made some cross references in order to use as much as possible the content of the FIDIC conditions of contract. Because as Adriana mentioned, there are already clauses referring to ESHS issues, and we felt it was necessary at some point to be more precise. So maybe you can just come back. Yes, thank you. No, just come back again. Yes, thank you. So I have to go quickly, but I have 3 examples for the first one is in the FIDIC general conditions of contract. There is a clause provisions about commencement of works where there are several conditions that have to be fulfilled before the works can start. And regarding ESHS issues, we added an additional condition, which is the fact that the contractor must provide its own environmental and social management plan to the engineer, and it has to be approved before the works start. So to be sure that the ESMP is fine and is consistent with the requirements we have in the contract. So it's the first example of additions to the FIDIC conditions of contract. You can go on. So this one, I'm just going to talk about the protections of environment. Adriana talked about this provision of clause 4.18 about protections of environments and other clauses dealing also with environment. It's some paragraphs, and we feel it was necessary to have more precise specifications. So we have 10 pages in the ESHS specifications about waste management, biodiversity, site rehabilitation, and so on. And we put in the particular conditions of contract that the provisions of clause 4.18 are complemented by those listed in the specification, and the contractor must comply with all the ESHS specifications and the general conditions of contract from FIDIC. You can go to next slide, and you can go on. Yes, again. Last example to show you the management of non-conformities. So the engineer has to make inspection on works, and he can find that the contractor does not conform with some ESHS requirements. And the non-conformity will be classified with several levels, so level 0 to level 3. And the contractor has to correct the non-conformity within a short period of time. The period is specified in the specification. And if not, the non-conformity will automatically be escalated to the next higher level. And when reaching level 3, then sanctions can be taken based on the contract provisions. So again, we use the FIDIC conditions of contract and the provisions from clause 14.7, 8.8, and 15.2 about payment suspension, work suspension, or termination of the contract. And so this sanction already existing in the contract, the FIDIC general conditions can be used in case of non-compliance with ESHS requirements. And the last slide is just to show the modification or the addition we made in the particular conditions to make sure that the sanctions listed in the ESHS specification are applicable to the contract and can be opposable to the contractor. So we made, again, this cross-reference between the general conditions of contract and the ESHS specification. So I'm done with my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emeline. That was brilliant. And if I can particularly comment that the power in your approach is an owner taking responsibility for the projects it chooses and designing them from the outcome to achieve those goals. That was fantastic. Our next speaker is Eugenio Zoppis. He's a project manager with Webuild. That kind of understates the range of projects he's been involved in and for how long he's been involved in those projects, which I won't mention Eugenio. Not only is Eugenio a civil engineer, but he also has a law degree and a master's in construction law and dispute resolution from King's College, and is a PhD researcher in risk management. So it's always delightful to have speakers who are as engaged in the learning component of this field as well, because there's a lot out there. So Eugenio, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kiri. And I will give a general view from the contractor side standpoint, and then I will also introduce points from the experience of the project I'm managing now. Is a large hydropower in Africa, but with a view of European contractor. And in any case, so the first point is that is now becoming common to understand the need to reduce the carbon footprint and working towards a net zero target for the future. The contractors have quite clear that and start getting commitment even on voluntary basis. But in practice, the commitment to decarbonize construction project must go through mandatory or voluntary adhesion through recognized standards, guidelines, or, for example, corporate policies. Next. Just to mention some of the standards, we have, of course, the FIDIC Climate Change Charter. It's new now, and companies start getting an understanding of that. Then World Bank Environmental and Social Framework. These are mandatory for projects that are funded by the World Bank, but they're becoming increasingly applicable to other internationally funded projects. For example, we have the International Finance Corporation, IFC, still of the World Bank. This is used in our project next for producing the environmental and social impact assessment, the environmental and social management plan, and all these monitoring action plans that are normally included in contracts, in large contracts like the one I'm managing, are getting applied according to these IFC standards. Of course, the IFC standard promote resource efficiency, energy use, water use, proper water use, and prevent pollution and the management. These gets measured and controlled through quarterly accounting of the carbon carbon gases emission on the project, and this leads to further application, like having a budget and having perhaps the targets for budget that can be introduced into the contract. Next. So under FIDIC contracts, these studies and these commitments are expressed into the employer requirement, the clause 418 of Silver Book, Emerald Book, or the specification in the Red Book, subclause 418, again, and the relevant obligations specified in the contract under the subclause 5.2 of the Green Book 2021. Then the application of these rules and KPI arises out of the application of the environmental and social action plan, which is mandatory, or other or other corporate plans, policies that are voluntary. And in the project I'm managing, we have the obligation that came out of the environmental and social management plan that is required under subclause 4.18. It is a silver book. Next. What can be done in large projects? First of all, conservation, restoration, and deforestation, the limiting interference with the natural environment, avoid cutting trees. In the photograph below, it is a camp that can lodge 7,500 workers, and it has been carved out in the forest, reducing the cutting of trees as much as possible. It's very green, you hardly see it. And other measures like developing trees and grass nursery, or securing their supply in areas where these can be purchased elsewhere out of the project. Restoration of areas that were cleared or used for temporary works, and then planting trees both for restoring areas which were uncovered by the works, or as a compensation measure in other areas which are near to the project or even elsewhere. Next. This is simply an example of how complex can be an afforestation plan in large projects. It shows areas which are cleared permanently, areas which are cleared temporarily, and measures that are necessary to prevent the erosion of the soil or even slides. Next. This is an example, again, of a slope that is being grassed to control erosion. And to give an idea of what can be done on a large project, we have put grass on 50,000 square meters of land, and we planted so far 16,500 trees in 4 years of work. So there can be a negative impact, but can also be a positive impact in terms of the actions that can be implemented in a large project as such. Next. The management of resources and energy is of course very, very important. There can be a waste management plan, but main point is the reduction of the consumption of diesel using renewable sources during construction. For example, in water projects, mini hydros can be applied, or the projects can be connected with the existing electric power grid without using generators. In our project, we have built a transmission line 148 kilometers long. It was worth economically and was worth environmentally. The use of electrical equipment and plant, crushing plant, batching plant are normally electric. Electrical equipment is normally used underground in tunneling work, but I see the possibility and the need to use electrical equipment also for surface work in the future, and this will bring a lot of benefits, not only for the environment but also economically for the project itself. Design must be done to minimize quantities and wastage. If we reduce the area, the extent of the project, then we save on the environment. The design to use the least polluting materials. This is important not only for the construction, but for the deconstruction and decommissioning at the end of the life cycle of the project. Recycling materials, quarrying, crushing, stock management. This is a normal measure, balancing both. Excavating and using the excavated material for crushing and doing the concrete doing the concrete for for the lining of the tunnel, for example, is a typical example. Then very important, the measure to composting the waste, the waste which can be that can be put into a landfill, like we have in our project, and recycling the waste either internally to the project or by transporting it outside in places where the waste can be recycled. Next. The management of water is very important. Avoid pollution first, treating the effluents of the water used, reducing as much as possible the use of water, design water-saving solution at all times, and reduce the emission of greenhouse gases from water reservoir in dam project. This is normally done by cutting as far as possible the green biomass from the reservoirs before impoundment. Next. This slides just shows the measures on top left. On top left of the photographs, you see the places where we can have segregation of materials or waste material. Below, how the material is segregated, and then it is ready to be carted away and reused. These are barrels, can be used again. The scrap metals can be melted and used to produce steel for further use in the society. Next. The point is that we have to have a circular economy for sustainable projects. The inputs for so much of input, there must be equivalent output that goes through protection and restoration and recycling as much as possible, as mentioned by Adriana before. Next. Then the management of water for sustainability goes through the design. The social use of water, for example, the ecological flow in downstream of a dam, is essential and it is normally understood. But I wanted to show this is a real example. We can see like spillway and middle level outlets are created specifically to have an artificial flood release in the river and recreate the seasonal flooding as it was in nature before the dam was built. So in this case, we can keep the natural course of the events in the river. And that shows the power of engineers. Next. Moving towards a net zero must be an effort, not only of contractors, but must involve all the parties and the stakeholders in the project. There cannot be one contractor doing the job, but must be all contractors in a large project that work towards the same direction, have the same goals. Suppliers must be involved to produce materials that reduce the emission of greenhouse gases. Reducing the transport by choosing suppliers that are near the area of the project. Otherwise, we will have long transporting lines that could cause pollution. Engineers and designers, as I have explained before, they have a great responsibility for designing projects that are low carbon, using the best technology for that. Employers and developers must have this commitment at heart, and they must be prepared to pay higher cost if necessary, but they are leading the process from procurement to the entire life cycle of the project, up to thinking about decommissioning the project and the waste that will be created at that stage. In short, this must be a collaborative effort integrated by all parties and stakeholders, having aligned targets that bring to the same result towards achieving the net zero by 2050 for each and every project in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Eugenio. And it sounds like Webuild are well on the way to entrenching these practices as part of their business as usual. And I possibly will come back to ask you a question about that when we get to question time in 10 minutes or so. Our fourth speaker is Millie Farmelo. Millie's a lawyer in the Arup legal team, Arup being a global consulting practice, providing the design services on many of the projects that our previous speakers have been talking to. And I'm really keen to get Millie's perspective because she's at the front line negotiating day by day a huge range of contracts that are trying to tackle this issue, and is probably seeing the full range of both good and bad approaches to this issue. So Millie, over to you. What are you seeing on the ground?
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Kiri. So what we've been examining today is how we can use contracts to drive sustainability practices and integrate net zero requirements into our projects. Now, I'm going to look at this in a more general sense. I'm not going to focus in on a particular type of contract, but I'm going to take a more holistic approach to understand how we as the consultants can have a positive influence in our drive to become more sustainable. Now, as Eugenio was alluding to, it's apparent that achieving net zero will require the entire supply chain to be engaged. We need to get everyone involved in working towards these common goals. We need to tackle it at various different levels and using multiple different routes. So as the consultant on the project, I'm going to focus on Arup's reach of influence, which extends downstream to our sub-consultants, but also our influence on the client and also the industry at large. So to begin with, I'll touch upon how we can influence our sub-consultants. Now, Arup's purchase goods and services dominate our emissions profile, as they do for many other professional consultants within the built environment. Therefore, if any of our projects have any element of subcontracting, it gives us an excellent opportunity to have a positive influence on the ethical supply chain behaviour using the contracts. So this, an example of this could be requiring the subconsultant to comply with particular environmental policies, to appoint a nominated person responsible for carbon reduction, to report on their scope emissions, or perhaps to deliver to a carbon reduction plan with performing against set targets. And all of these obligations can be accompanied by monitoring and enforcement mechanisms, ranging from fairly soft requirements to the more onerous ones, like termination rights if the subconsultant fails to comply. We could also use the subcontract as a means to collect environmental data. So by bringing together data from disparate sources, parties are able to have a greater insight into carbon emissions throughout the wider project lifecycle, which will enable everyone to make smarter decisions more holistically rather than in isolation. And it can also assist from a compliance perspective, which is particularly important with the increase in regulatory and legislative requirements that we're beginning to see now. However, this does mean that the whole supply chain has to work together collaboratively, and all these contracts throughout the entire project lifecycle needs to contain these similar flexible data sharing clauses, allowing for the creation of an integrated data network. Now, moving on from our subcontracts to our contracts with the client. And firstly, it's important to highlight that although capturing these sustainability obligations within our contracts is really, really important because it holds parties accountable and prevents the good intentions falling by the wayside or being value engineered out when project finances begin to stretch. It's also really important to ensure that if we are required to comply to these types of obligations, that they are realistic, that they're appropriate, and that they're achievable when considering the scope of services. And what we're beginning to see within our contracts that we're getting from the clients is that there are very heavy-handed ways of risk transfer. So quite unsophisticated, quite client-driven, blunt mechanisms within the contracts serving as a stick to achieve certain outputs. So for example, quite onerous KPIs which are linked to liquidated damages. And it's often the case that these net zero clauses are shoehorned into the contract, and they're quite ill-conceived, they're quite optimistic, and imposed without proper consideration of what actually is achievable. So an example of that is that we're seeing within contracts the requirement to guarantee the performance of something, so a building or a piece of infrastructure. But generally, as the consultant, we don't have the sufficient control over how the asset is constructed or how the asset is used. So it's just not something that we can 100% guarantee. What may be appropriate, however, is warranting that the outcome of the services is capable of meeting the whole life obligations. However, we've got to include some robust assumptions around the use and the construction of the asset as well. Now, outside of the contract conditions, we also have the expertise to influence the project at an operational level. So using our experience, we should be considering at the earliest possible moment, but also at any point throughout our services, what we can do and whether there are any opportunities for us to discuss climate change with the client in an attempt to spot how we can add value to the project by sharing the ways in which we can deliver our services in a more sustainable but also a more circular way. An example of where an open dialogue with the client led to a positive change was in a recent major buildings refurbishment project. And Arup's developer client was relying on hitting certain decarbonisation KPIs. And they were relying on that because it would enable them to qualify for green financing, which typically rewards the borrower through interest rate reduction. And it became clear throughout the project that the client was not on track to meet the decarbonisation KPI. However, Arup was able to step in and offer additional services to provide a life cycle assessment of the embodied carbon and make recommendations for reducing that embodied carbon in later stages of the project. So not only did that unlock huge value for the client in securing the interest rate reduction, but it also led to a closer working relationship on decarbonisation going forward. Now, when we're looking for opportunities in our services to be more sustainable, it's also really important to consider whether there are any perceived gaps or deficiencies within the scope. So an example of this is where design codes and standards may not be keeping up with what we already know with regard to climate change. And when the gap is big enough between what we already know and what the code says, reliance on them might not be sufficient. Now, I'm not saying that all codes are wrong, but I just think that we need to be in a position to be able to identify where design codes might be inadequate with regard to climate change, and if they are, to advise and discuss with the client accordingly. Now, some standards might be imposed by law or regulation, and therefore these will need to be followed, even if we don't think that even if we're not entirely satisfied with them. However, if that's the case, then it's just something that needs to be discussed with the client to see whether the regulatory standard actually represents best practice and whether or not we can design above that standard if permitted by a relevant regulation. So essentially, responding to climate change on project is likely to require the parties to be agile and flexible. And going back to the contract, we just need to ensure that the contract allows us to do this and enables us to make those changes and add scope and services with ease. And the contract should consider whether any of these changes will impact any carbon targets that are applicable and include an appropriate mechanism enabling these carbon-related objectives to be adjusted accordingly should that be required. And that's particularly important when the targets are linked to incentives or penalties. Now, besides from influencing our sub-consultants and our clients, we should also be considering how we can increase our scope of influence on a wider scale. So, for example, third parties involved in the project, but also on separate projects altogether. And we should be aspiring to shape the industry norm, to shape standard practice in the industry contract forms, building a common understanding and a consistent approach to delivering these low carbon solutions. And we can think about doing that via certain roles, for example. So those roles which have more extensive oversight of the whole project, i.e. a project manager, who might have the ability to oversee the project from start to finish and can essentially be a kind of guardian of a system which ensures a consistent and common objectives are included throughout the whole project. So all the contracts and all the documents, and might also have the ability to influence the project board's governance and approvals. So including those relevant net zero targets that we want to see. In addition to that, we can work with the industry institutions and organisations. So, for example, FIDIC or NEC or the Chancery Lane Project, which, for those of you who don't know, is a not-for-profit initiative where they bring together lawyers but also technical professionals to discuss and develop climate change clauses and model laws to essentially fight climate change. So working together to do this type of work, we can develop the type of clauses that we want to start seeing in the contracts and ensure that they work for everyone. So the practicalities work and they're appropriate for the party that's agreeing to them. And this collaboration can also help develop industry forms so that they better address climate change. So, for example, very recently within the NEC suite, the new NEC option X29, which has recently been released as a consultative edition, aims to reduce the project's environmental impact. So it introduces into the contract performance table and collaboration clauses and climate change execution plans, among other things. By and large, however, the choice of project and its overall context is the best way that we can reduce carbon. And we need to be asking ourselves the big question of, can we do things better? Arup is involved in the Construction Innovation Hub Value Toolkit, which is being developed in the UK market and aims to change the driving force behind decision-making in construction. So it's shifting the focus on costs and time towards a more value-based approach. And the intention of this approach is to ask the question early on, what are we doing here? How are we going to tackle this? And it aims to inspire teams to be more agile and creative with their solutions. And if that's not possible, if we're not able to influence the client, if we're not able to influence the suppliers, then we should be considering walking away from projects that don't align with the UN sustainability goals. So that's something that Arup's committed to do for jobs which involve the extraction, the refinement and the transportation of hydrocarbon-based fuels going forward. Now, to conclude, including net zero and sustainability requirements within our contracts needs to be just one part of a very carefully planned stream of carbon reduction activities, although it is, of course, a very vital part. And it often feels difficult to feel like we can make a contribution to the climate crises and the amount of carbon that we're putting out there into the world. However, I think through influencing the parties, through influencing the supplier, the client, the industry, and pushing for the adoption of a more integrated value chain, where we're communicating in a common language and working collaboratively in an innovative environment, then I think we do have a real chance to make a difference and to proactively challenge the status quo. Thanks very much, Kiri.
Thank you so much, Millie. We're now going to move into the Q&A phase, and we've got some questions coming through on the chat line, so keep on putting them through. I've got a list of questions that I've already built up from that course and the questions that have come up so far. So I might start up with the last question that's come through, which it was on my list as well, which is around the use of the Dispute Avoidance and Adjudication Board. And I might throw this one to you, Adriana, first, followed by Emeline. Because of course the DAB is a governance tool that can help monitor progress, monitor compliance. How do you think about the role of the DAAB in also supporting the achievement of these goals? And in particular, the question has been asked, do you think the fact that so many of the DAAB meetings have gone virtual and they can't see the site and get up close to it is a barrier to make for the DAB playing this role in achieving these goals?
Thank you, Kiri, for this question. I have a lot of first-hand experience because in the last years I was on 7 standing dispute boards, and I have worked only virtually. And I can tell you that many of the reservations about this are not true, because we are learning and getting more experience, and we can even look at the people and see their behavior, the body language. It's not the same like being together face to face. but I think this is really a good option, because when you have the virtual site visits, you can focus on the most important issues which can escalate into disputes. You can imagine the big saving of carbon emissions. I have calculated for myself that I saved about more than 10 tons of carbon emissions not going to the relevant sites. And you can imagine that you can have more frequent site visits in future, having this virtual site visit opportunity. And I see the future as having from the beginning site visit, which is the parties to get together to know each other, but later on to have these virtual site visits. And if there are some issues which are very serious and some particular things have to be seen on the site, then to have an allocated site visit, which is face-to-face. Otherwise, I don't see any problem. And in my experience, it is really very positive from these virtual site visits, because people get to know each other. I have been through a whole project with this site visits in Ukraine, and now in Bulgaria we are proceeding also very well in another project. Of course, when you step in on projects, when the dispute board is appointed in the end of the projects, they have many problems, and it is a different situation. But talking about dispute prevention, and talking about the importance of site visits, we have now all the new instruments. For example, if the contractor prepares visualization of the site with the drone, I know that Eugenio has done this on this African site, and this gives you very quickly a very good impression. Can you imagine if you go to this hydrotechnical project or to another infrastructure project, sometimes it takes 3 days just to go around the project. And if you lose 3 days for the traveling from another country, and this is a very expensive exercise, you know how high are the rates of the dispute board members. I don't see anything lost from this virtual site visit if it is well organized. For example, depending on the type of the projects, on some projects we have used Google Photographs with titling of the relevant works, so that you can receive them before the site visits, and during the site visits they're presented by the contractor. On other projects, if you go with the drone over the site, it takes you to the most important works, and you can see also mobilization, you can see all the important issues. Even you cannot see all this happening. What you are missing is really the direct contact with the people, but we have been living in Zoom for several years, so I don't see any problem. And I'm sure in the future we shall work virtually with a starting face-to-face visit. Some are talking that maybe we shall have quarterly visits on the site with monthly virtual visits, but I'm sure we shall use more of it. Thanks, Kiri.
Thank you, Adriana. Oh, look, I might pass across to Emeline because I'd like to get the owner's perspective. Is the DAAB another useful tool that you've been able to leverage to help support the ESHS goals of the ADF?
Thank you. Good question. I'm not sure to have the answer. I have no experience on the use of the DAAB or the DAB procedures for ESHS problems or issues, but I think it could be useful if there are difference in opinion between the contractor and the engineer regarding the non-conformities that can be found out during a supervision or during the inspection. So I guess that if the relations start to be a bit difficult between the contractor, the engineer, and the employer, the DAB can be a useful tool to prevent escalating the difficulties between the parties.
Thank you, Emeline. I might throw my next question across to Eugenio. This is coming up in a few of the questions, which is the cost of compliance. And there's a lot of comments that it comes at an extra cost. And maybe people are thinking that it has to come at an additional cost. Do you know if there is any studies that are coming in about what it's costing, the overall impact of compliance on our project costs? And the other thing that's sitting in my head is you were talking about a lot of really practical things that contractors do to achieve these environmental goals, very sound, straightforward business practices like good waste recycling. Are some of these costs actually savings that we haven't been taking up before? Are some of them just starting to be built into business as usual practices and aren't a separate line item in a cost item? So what are you thinking about this cost conversation that we're having around sustainability and getting to net zero?
Of course, there is no study that I know of that focus on the cost and the saving of applying green provisions in a contract. Applying green provision in contract comes on one side to a cost, and the price is paid eventually by the client, by the owner, by the developer. But when the contractor prepares the price for the contract, also keeps into account the savings that can make and will for the application of green measures which are favorable to the economy of the project. So all these processes come naturally. So additional cost for the application of certain measure, the cost of carrying out the plans, the control plans, and applying them in the contract, there must be there. Studying the measures and applying the measures as a cost. On the other hand, the contractors will naturally apply the savings that come out of it, and they will bring it into the price in order to have a competitive tender. So I think this all comes quite natural. But that is quite right. It would be very interesting to study the matter from academic point of view and try to see different viewpoints and come to some conclusion of what will come out of it.
Yeah, I might have a follow-on question for you, which is, are you bringing these sustainability practices to all of your projects, irrespective of whether the client is asking for them or not? So I suppose the question is a contractor like Webuild actually changing its business practices to meet these goals just as a matter of course?
Yes, yeah, definitely yes. It's a matter of culture, there is a quality culture and the safety culture. The green culture is becoming part of important contractors and of not only at corporate level, but it has to filter down to workers. I can see that happening every day and improving every day. For the other question, it is yes, because international financing institutions require the application of certain plans, and so there has to be, even if voluntarily, there is a follow-up to all these measures. No project can be financed without the application without an impact assessment and the management plan and the following up of certain measures. then there is a matter of reputation of a corporation. So again, a large contractor would not undertake a project that does not guarantee the minimum of the international standards. We have corporate policies that we apply irrespective of whether they are mandated in the contract or not. And I believe that applying these measures in the contract won't make a lot of a difference in the contracting industry in the future.
Thank you. That's wonderful. My next question is for Millie. And Millie, you were talking about some experiences you had with collaborative contracting, and I think that's such a big term in our industry at the moment. To what extent do you think collaborative contracting can really bring above the norm outcomes in this area of sustainability? And what can we do inside those models that we perhaps can't do inside traditional contracting models?
I think it's a really powerful tool to enable parties to agree to these types of obligations and requirements. I think it's just about having those tools and guidance there at their hands. I think a lot of parties, it's quite overwhelming knowing where to start and how to integrate this into contracts. And I think that's part of the problem. It's just that it's not become a well-trodden path. You know, I think people are very willing and open to agree to these. It's just about getting them in. So including it within the, you know, sort of in the example of the NEC for X29, having it there at the party's fingertips, I think it will be hugely beneficial. Whereas traditional contracts, or contracts that don't address this, it's just knowing where to start and how to get it in. So I think it's just becoming familiar with it, and then hopefully from there it will become something we see more of in contracts.
Yes, so Millie, the traditional contract requires us sort of to have everything known and defined up front, but the collaborative models allow us to work through issues as they arise and make the trade-offs and the decisions and make what works for that team and for that project and for that owner's needs along the way. It allows us to be more flexible.
Yeah, exactly.
That's great. I've got another question about decarbonisation, because this has come up in a few questions. I'm not quite sure who's going to volunteer for this one, because if we stop and thinking about it, environmental safety, health of our workers has actually been in our contracts for a long time. And in our Q&A, we've certainly had some ongoing observations about, oh gosh, the contracts have had these things in them for a long time. How do you think this fits with actually tackling the issue of decarbonisation, whether that's around choosing projects, better projects, or not doing projects, or measuring carbon? What is your particular views on actually doing making the decisions and framing up projects in a way that will actually get us to these kinds of outcomes? I'm going to perhaps volunteer somebody to answer this if nobody takes their mic off. Anthony, you've taken your mic off. You sound like you have a comment.
Well, I've already presented on this subject, and we've got the Sustainability Committee working on it. So I thought it's worth
thank you.
Chiming in. So the first thing is a project often has a financial balance sheet these days. And we can all look at every asset, and we can construct that balance sheet over the whole of the life of the asset and look at the economic returns and so forth. There is absolutely no reason why we can't do the same with greenhouse gas emissions, and establish before we start what the greenhouse situation is with the site we're working on, and then through the whole process measure and monitor the performance both through the construction phase and obviously then right through the operational and demolition phases. So the carbon balance or greenhouse balance sheet is the first thing. The second thing is that we should be asking already, if we're not, for embodied carbon or embodied energy statements from product manufacturers and material suppliers. And that's already happening in some countries. I won't say it's right across industries yet, but in our contracts, we can start to drive that. And then I guess you've already picked up on one thing there, which is to do with the alliance and the collaborative contracting models. The alliance model itself has some tremendous pieces in it, which suit it really does suit the idea of focusing on decarbonisation as a team, as a whole project team, including the owner. And to me, that model has application in this context, and it doesn't have to be a pure alliance on everything on the project, but constructing a contract which is potentially a hybrid of our current forms of contract plus the alliance model focused on decarbonisation might well give us a way forward. I think these are things we have to explore. They're not, at this point in time, they're not completely defined by any means, but people are starting to try these things. We have already got the models being built by various consulting firms in our industry, which enable us to monitor carbon. We have lots of material around about carbon capture by trees and different sized trees and all sorts of grasses. So this information is available, and it's time, I suspect, the industry started embracing it, and we've got to get ahead of the game. Talking about the things we've already done for the last 20 years isn't going to help us. We have to define a new way forward, which is going to focus on decarbonisation.
Thanks, Anthony.
Thanks,
and I might give Emeline one last option. You know, where do you think the French Development Agency is on its journey on this topic?
So just to understand, so I'm part of the procurement divisions, and we have many colleagues also dealing with environmental and social aspects, and they are more knowledgeable on this topic. But what I can say is that, as I mentioned, we are trying to target the Paris Agreement objectives. So we try to as much as possible in the project we finance to take into consideration decarbonization. And for instance, what Anthony said about the supply of goods and equipment, we are trying to think about how to improve the supply of goods and equipment, and having also these questions about where the equipment are produced, how they are produced, what are the conditions in which they are produced, and to improve also the supply chain and to have requirements for the supply chain as well, both in the environmental and social aspects and health and safety, but also on the carbon content, if we can say like that. So it's also an important part of our visions and the discussions we have, of course, with the project owners, because as we are financing institution, and we have to discuss also all of that with the project owners that are fully responsible for the procurement process and the content of the bidding documents. But we are part of the discussion with them to try to go further on this topic with the project owners.
That sounds like what we've got is an emerging real sort of, I was going to say push-pull, but I think it's a push-push, because we've got everybody at multiple levels of our industry pushing for this change. And the more we put it front and center, the more likely we are to get to it. I think I've got one last question that I'm going to throw to Millie, which is, do you think the industry standard, and then I'll let Adriana have a moment on this question as well, because I think Adriana will be in this field as well. Do you think the industry standards, the measures in market for measuring for this, you know, the bodies setting the standards, are they up to scratch, or are they running as fast and hard as everybody else?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I think that they do hinder our drive towards a more sustainable future. Equally, they can be a really powerful tool in helping us fight climate change. But with our understanding of climate change increasing, and obviously the rate of technology advancing, I don't think it's surprising that many of these codes and standards are behind the curve. So, for example, I'm talking about in terms of resilience, a significant proportion of these codes have been built on historic weather data without any adjustment for future impacts of climate change. So therefore, in times of rapid change, they poorly characterize the diversity of weather that assets are going to be exposed to. Also, a lot of the standards miss out some really important issues that are arising. So for example, with the shift to a more carbon neutral future, we're going to be seeing a lot more use in electric cars, but guidance on electric cars is lacking. So another example, underground car parks in the UK, they have there's not enough guidance around how these electric cars burn differently from petrol and diesel cars, and just generally these standards tend to specify the bare minimum, so setting the acceptable threshold too low. So I mean, we can address these deficiencies by designing above the standard, but then that assumes that the client will be able and willing to spend more than they necessarily have to, which is not necessarily the case. And also some codes are more of a tick box exercise, so it can be difficult to design above the standard. So I think that we do need to take a look at these codes again and have an overhaul of the system. And I don't think it's something that we can overlook, particularly seeing as, you know, the built environment accounts for sort of 40% of global emissions. So I do think it's something that needs to be addressed.
So the government and regulatory framework is dreadfully important as well to achieve what we're wanting, where we're wanting to get to. Adriana, maybe if I can give you 1 minute before we go to our final polls of anything else you want to add, especially on this regulatory and framework question.
Yeah, I would add something which is very important, just to appoint the consultants from the beginning of the project, and then the consultants will help you focus on the whole life performance. Then related to those questions about the cost, we have to take into account always the whole life performance. And of course, since standards, everything is in development, if you have an experienced consultant, from the beginning, there might be different alternatives, but you have to select sometimes which is the best one to renovate or to demolish. And this has a much huger impact and then any measures which have much less impact later on. So select your consultants on the quality base and take their advice.
Thank you so much, Adriana. And there is a cost. We just might be paying for it later on. So we've got two last questions that we're going to throw back to you. If we could pull up the first question, please. So do you think you're going to be paying more attention to your net zero provisions in your contracts going forward? Yes or no? Let's see if we've shifted your views in the last hour and a half. We'll give you just a few more seconds to answer that question. And what answer did we get? Yes, absolutely. So hopefully that says that we have at least really started the conversation off in this particular area. And our third poll, which is, have you signed up to the FIDIC Climate Change Charter yet? And we'll give everyone 30 seconds to answer that question. Of course, that one might not be applicable to absolutely all of you, but just fascinating to find out what percentage of our audience is absolutely at the cutting edge of this area. And if we could have the results on question 3. No, but 23% of you have, so I'm really impressed by that as well, because of course there's multiple ways we can all make our individual commitments to climate change. That takes us almost to the very end of this session. Tony, maybe if I could hand over to you to do your final thanks and farewell, then encourage everyone to come along to the next session.
So thank you very much, Kiri, and thank you to great speakers. That was a really great session. I think it was started out very pragmatically on what we can do, what's available to us already in our body of contracts, what we need to do going forward, and what are our opportunities for improvement. So I thought that really, there were great ideas in there and a lot of great opportunities for us. I thank you all. I thank the Secretariat, and I thank you all for participating. Over the next couple of weeks, you'll see there on the slide in front of you, we have the FIDIC Africa, FIDIC North America and Latin America, and then FIDIC Asia, Australasia contract users regional conferences. You can register your place on fidic.org. I encourage you to do so. They're all going to be virtual conferences this year. And then I'd like to extend an invitation to all of you to join us in Geneva for an in-person conference. It's going to be a hybrid again, but most of us are hoping to get there in person on the 11th, 12th, 13th of September in Geneva. So I'd love to welcome you to that. And lastly, as you may know, we have lots of awards in FIDIC, and there is a few there on your screen: the Future Leaders Award, the Projects Award, and the Member Association Award. So invite you to enthusiastically apply for those. And later in the year, we will also have our contract awards. So please be encouraged. Love to see more of you in person. I certainly have seen many of you on Zoom, and I hope you have enjoyed these webinars with us. And so thank you, Kiri. Thank you, team. Much appreciated. Good night.